I just wanted to highlight up front that our panel has the hardest job, and it's unfair. Both the professor and then Dr. Geis, we were asked to talk about the commonalities and security implications. I got to read exactly what they told us. Synthesize the previous panel and speaker insights. Distill overarching security implications by assessing the impact of security cooperation, economics, geopolitics, and other factors of change. And then were the international organizations changing our resistance? Well, so I started yesterday by writing down as each speaker went a few things, and there was too much, it was overwhelming, which is a good thing. So I just wanted to highlight that part up front, that the dialogue and different ideas have been very interesting. And when you get in the regional parts, they're really complicated. And then you go, but that's just that one region, right? And they're all connected. So I just want to highlight up front that we have the hardest job, so we should get extra benefits when we fit done. So I thought I would talk, since we had the Canadian perspective and then EU, that I would give a military perspective because we haven't, the implications for the security part. It's what's below the heading, right? A changing international order, and what are the implications in the security environment. So I thought I would do some security environment, but then bring it down to defense more directly, since we have more uniformed folks in the room this afternoon, probably because the boss was here, so they all had to show up. And I want to highlight the both ends we heard. So yesterday we had Ben Roswell and Lieutenant General Lantier they started it, and then we finished with the talk on Korea. And those two ends really kind of highlighted a few things that I thought were pretty interesting. One was the persistent tensions that we heard yesterday and then today, and something that I think most people don't appreciate in the world anymore. Deterrence and escalation and de-escalation are not terms we've really talked about in a big way for lots of years. Certainly post-1991, not very much. And in many ways, minus the nuclear threat, for the United States, probably been since Midway Island in 1943 that we've really had a concern probably about strategic risk and the conversations we have in this room, right? That you can actually surprise people now, right? And I'll talk some more about that. And then there's so many channels, they both mentioned, so many channels for intention and influence. So how do you choose? You think about the challenge for our leaders today, our political and military and interagency leaders, to have a camera in their face all the time. And then you think of when we, in the United States, we look back at World War II and FDR and his fireside chats and Eisenhower, and there was press pools, but there was a huge long flash to bang time between things they would discuss. And even though it might show up in the paper the next day, it was not like it is today. And they were only being asked about something, this sounds like only being asked about what happened in the Battle of the Bulge, or here, or somewhere else, right? But now they're getting hit up, well, what do you think about the European Union? What do you think about the southern border? And by the way, what's your Arctic plan? And what's the plan for South Asia? And don't forget Antarctica too, because there's a few people, research scientists who want help down there, right? It's really kind of amazing what they're asked to be ready for. And the military and the national security arrangements in many ways to be ready to support all of those if something happens. Kind of crazy. One thing I also took from yesterday that I thought was really interesting was, and I didn't realize this part, was this, the attitude post-World War II about the Soviets. Because it really, it was a very interesting conversation, those who weren't in the room, about attitudes and domestic interests. And we've talked a lot for the last 2 days that domestic viewpoints really matter. But really they matter most, in an election they matter, but really it's over the long term. Right, and so they can truly change a nation's foreign outlook over time, and that was the sense we got yesterday. We heard that story, and I did not realize Canada's role in building the NATO coalition, right? And we heard a little bit yesterday about some of those discussions were in complete secrecy, and I find that a fascinating part we haven't really talked about, that there's no secrets anymore. We're all for transparency, we're democratic governments, but sometimes you actually want world leaders and other people to have a conversation that isn't on the news or on social media and 20 minutes later, right? Because, President Trump did that, Trudeau did that, Merkel said this. We know an hour afterwards if one of them took 2 bites when the other was, and spoke with their mouth open, right? It's kind of crazy, but so it's very hard to have candid conversations, right? And so what are the implications in the security environment for the hard part about having to have real conversations, to be able to be critical of each other and not have it turn into something that really wasn't meant to be. If it was meant to be critical, we have the same problem. It's meant to be critical so we can all learn and grow. It's not meant to poke in the face. But now everything comes across or is perceived as a poke in the face. So we talked about a changing international order. I'm positive it's changing, but I'm positive it was always kind of changing. That's just the John Kem view. Certainly 25 years ago, post the fall of the Soviet Union, and you saw the 90s in Bosnia and Haiti and all those things as they evolved over time. I think Robert Bain said yesterday there was never stasis. I would agree with that. I'm probably a faster cycle now. Like I said, we find out about things quicker. And whether it's Brexit or the latest storm or disaster or administration, they all might change the speed of that a tiny bit, but the reality is it's been changing the whole time. And I'd like to highlight a couple of those because one of the things we work on at the Army War College with students is historical mindedness, because people really don't read history anymore. They don't read it all, right? If there isn't a good movie on it, then why would you ever pay attention to it, right? I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but yesterday we talked about Latin America and One Belt, One Road, and today on Indo-Pacific and NATO discussions. And does the U.S. go it alone too much? Is the West not united? But if you look back, it implies like we always were really closely united all the time, and we really weren't. We were united in the big scheme of things, but not on individual issues. We didn't sing Kumbaya at a lot of forums, right? And do we really want to return to the Cold War, right? The specter of abrupt nuclear war, economic dislocation. We forget there was coups in Africa, coups in Latin America, coups in Africa, coups in the Middle East. There was a divided Europe, nation states at wars, the debacle in Vietnam that really broke a lot of trust between the politics and the social contract in our country. And now we look back at it, we call those disagreements, right? When you look back, oh, there were some disagreements in the Cold War, right? They were a little more than disagreements, right? And some of them were pretty, and that sounds like Robert's Rules of Order. Well, it was just a kind of parliamentary debate. And frame them they were framed through Cold War looks. They were framed through the oil and energy focus. You think about the Suez Crisis that most people don't even pay attention, don't even realize that there was one, where the U.S., in the U.S.'s view, I would say, President Eisenhower thought the U.S. allies colluded with Israel, right, against Egyptian interests, and Ike wanted to have a more middle-of-the-road view, right? There was a clear French, UK versus U.S. view on how that played out, right? You can look at national socialist movements that picked up afterwards, right, in Syria and Egypt and Iraq. There was a U.S. intervention in Lebanon in 1958 that had implications in the Middle East that, for years later. You have the U.S., people did take sides, right? The question is, when you took sides, were you taking sides in everything or just for that particular issue? And I think in many cases it was about that issue, but we were allowed to frame it that it doesn't mean I hate you, right? But now we seem to take it, well, if I frame it differently, then we're not on the same sheet of music on lots of other things. A great example is Beirut, 1982-83. Huge twist, large casualties in the bombing of the Marine barracks, and a retreat that had huge signaling for Saddam and Khomeini, who thought that meant a lack of resolve from just the U.S. and the West writ large. All those things, huge implications later on. Hezbollah, Iranian focus on terrorism. The one key difference I would say now is our leaders believe, and I say leaders, I'm not putting this on political leaders, I'm putting it on all of us, right? Leaders believe they have the luxury to tear one another apart over every issue, right? Social media makes that so easy to do. Anybody can comment on anything, and if you're really good if you make it good and juicy enough, it'll resonate and it'll magnify and be like, wow, I just got that more hits. And if I'm selling ads, I just made some money, right? I have a friend who's a few years ago, he was very involved in gun rights, and he had a website, and I was like, that is the weirdest thing. Why do you have that? And he goes, I made $10,000 last year on ads, right? So for him, it was kind of fun, but it was also money-making, right? When you have that, so that's a very different world, and so I think that's the part. So how do we get ourselves to not tear ourselves apart on every issue? We have the luxury of it because we don't think of many of these things as existential threats, and they maybe aren't in the short term, but you can't say that large-scale migration and climate change and national security implications and the risk of ballistic missiles being spread and social justice over time has huge implications for democracy and all those things. I like to use that. I use magnets a lot in analogies, and so you look at we collectively in this group trying to think about how can defense and national security try to contribute to stability, and I'll talk some more about that in a second. And you remember when we were all kids and you're in elementary school when you first had your magnet lesson, and they gave you magnets and you had all the little tiny metal shards, And you can, as you move, it's cool, right? Even now, you see one of those, you'll pick it up and start waving it around, right? Even like you did when you're 6 years old, because it's really neat to see what pulls. And at some point, stuff stops pulling. But if you try to push, you can only move like 2 or 3 little things, and they all push to the side. That's really how the international order kind of works, right? There's a push and a pull, and things drop off, and it's really messy. So what does that mean for us in the security environment? Really, I would argue that for defense and security, provide stability in the midst of change. It's not perfect stability. There's going to be things, but that's really, so what do we have to do? We have to prepare for futures we can't know. We spend a lot of time talking about that at the War College and other places. The analogy that some of our folks have used talks about, we see the hurricane map as hurricanes going through the Caribbean, and you can see the prediction where it's going to hit. And 5 days out, it's about the whole East Coast, and 3 days out, it's between Florida and South Carolina, or it's in the Gulf of Mexico, and a day out, they go this one town. But we all can forecast 10 to 15 years ahead and see some reasonable path, right, in terms of security that we all should be prepared for. And how you get, and we talked about some of those things. What are they? It's Russia and China, how they're rolling that threat. It was interesting as we talked about the One Belt, One Road initiative that people talked about China was experimenting. And it would sound like, well, it was just an experiment, so that's okay. But then inside the liberal world order, are we allowed to experiment? Or does it have to be exactly the same? I would argue we're supposed to experiment. And so some of the things that everybody's trying are experiments. They don't fundamentally change the order. But if you're not trying to be agile, adaptive, and try something different, then you do have stasis. And the World Bank of today is not the World Bank of 20 years ago, but then it wasn't the World Bank of 30 years ago. And same with the IMF and all those other kind of things. Sometimes I think we're a little too hard on the glory of the past. So I think I got a sense from some of the talks about Korea and about NATO today that defense is strong, but security is not. Right? In other words, we heard what the speaker this morning say that certainly if the Russians attacked in the long run, NATO's got more than enough oomph to make it stop and push them back. But no one wants to have that happen. That'd be ugly. But the security part is much harder, and so that's a place for all of us to, as we go forward from this conference, to think about what do we need to do. And the second part is it has to be at lower cost over time. Right? I think that came out from the speaker yesterday, who said that China's investing billions, tens and tens of billions of dollars in Latin America and South America, and the U.S. is failing to match it or do something. Well, that's a hard. So what is the answer to that investment? Right? Is it to outcompete on investment? Because in many ways, there's been lots of investment by the United States, Canada, and lots of other countries in Latin America, South America, Africa, other places, to the tune of trillions of dollars over time. Some of it's stuck, some of it hasn't. So is the answer more money? Well, then, how do we collectively decide to do that? Because that's both a push and a pull thing. And no politician in any country in a democracy is going to stand up and go, let's go spend $1.5 trillion somewhere else and not at home and get reelected in lots of ways. You can do some of it, but so unless you have the collective will of all of you saying we all agree we need to do this, it doesn't happen, right? And so that's a hard thing. So what is our role in defense and security in those cases? Because we all know that those have defense and security implications. And our role is to reduce the options, to reduce uncertainty and provide more options in the security framework for future leaders, right? We heard that in the talk about Korea today, to make sure that we have that between the sending states and all that part, have we set conditions as best we can now, but also not prejudge what 10 years from now will be or 20 years from now. So that's our role in the room, is to think about those implications. Because what we would want to do is to set up for a future prime minister to be stuck, or a future president to be stuck, or a future chancellor to be stuck, because we didn't imagine having security implications and risk calculations we do today. The last part, and then I'll kind of wind it up. Domestic and foreign policy are intimately related. We heard that in spades over the last 2 days. It's so true. And we see destabilizing actors in social media, the threat of bioterrorism, all trying to delegitimize institutions, right? How do you compete? How do you fight against that, right? You do it through education. That's not a natural place for the military, but we have a role in it, right? Because it's easy to go to a parade or go to a ball game and they salute the troops and you go, yes, thank you, and everybody claps, right? Yeah, I know the United States Army, I think the Canadian Army is pretty similar. It's not natural for us, it's not in our ethos to walk around trying to talk about, you know, things we're doing and they're important and those kind of things. It's just not a natural state. But how do you make sure people know the long-term interests of NATO and security cooperation and global engagement are all important? It's really hard to do, partially because you sound like a broken record, right? If you're a speaker and you do that 5 times, you go like, I feel like I've been doing this a million times. I said it five days in a row. Well, how many people even heard you? And how many really listened? And how many didn't turn off and then flip channels and go watch a sports event or their favorite binge watch, right? So it gets complicated. The last thing I'll say is it's a competitive environment, and holding it together and collective security it takes more work by all of us. And I'll talk some more about that when I get up and do the final conclusion for a minute. But in the end, that trajectory, right? The real question when you do trajectory is, and you all know magnetic north. If you have a compass, it points in Canada, right? True north is the North Pole. If we try to have a collective place saying we're going to go to the North Pole, we will not get there, right? But we'll end up in magnetic north or somewhere, someplace in the poles. Is that good? I mean, if we're above the Arctic Circle in that way, is that a good thing, right? So one of the things is to cut ourselves a little slack too, because sometimes we're like, we didn't get exactly where we said we're going to be. But that wasn't really the right space anyways. The right place is to be close enough that within the risk tolerance we all have, we're kind of happy and proud that we're in a pretty good place for the future.